It's time for OCG Tales 2, and we're talking about locals culture. All right. Always interesting to hear more stories from the OCG, so today's lunch break, we're going to watch some Sunny. Let's go.
A very common complaint towards Konami is that they keep printing cards and designing too many bulk unusable cards where there's nowhere to play them. And to be fair to Konami, it has been getting better on an infrastructural level TCG side. With the advent of Genesis format, there's a company-supported format that has frequent balance changes, communication, and a lower level power meta.
Okay, I've definitely said this before, but to be fair, I didn't mean stuff like Radiant Typhoon that ends up like maybe a tier 3 deck in Advanced Constructed. I don't view those as bulk or should not have been printed, because I do understand that like when you make new cards, not everything is going to be a hit. Sometimes you try to make something good and then it just doesn't quite work out, which I think is often the case. But then the ones that I'm like sometimes confused about are like the ones where it's freaking like what it's just the card doesn't even have a chance to be good, right? Because they just I can't think of an example, but there's definitely cards that are being printed where you can definitely tell the intention wasn't even to make it a good card. I'm not even talking about like Ascent or some like some of the archetypes. Of course, like some archetypes are worse than others, but I'm talking about like, you guys remember every time there's a new pack coming out, the last couple reveals for the set, like the last 5 or 10 cards that they reveal are always like pack filler, unplayable. Like they don't belong to any archetype, but they also have like a 0% chance of seeing play. And there's never like, or very rarely you'll find like a good generic card there, but for the most part it's just like that this card does not see play if it's printed 15 years ago, right? And that's just like, I don't understand why that's there.
That is magnificent, and I hope they continue to do that for as long as possible. However, I think this has the potential to obfuscate a cultural problem within the TCG, or not necessarily a problem, but just something that's worth thinking about. Please bear with me because I'm having a really hard time wording my thoughts on this one, but I think in general, the TCG player base has a more difficult time playing the game in a way that is not exclusively the most competitive way possible. And I guess my issue with the Genesis solution is that...
Yes, I think that's true. I think, or like, I mean, it's true for some people, I would say, because I do think, I was about to say like Yu-Gi-Oh is being played mostly as a very competitive game, and I think that part is true. And sometimes I wish we had more ways to enjoy the game or play the game in more casual ways. Like, for example, like draft, for example, which it's very understandable that Yu-Gi-Oh doesn't have draft because Yu-Gi-Oh packs are not meant to be drafted. You cannot really draft with Yu-Gi-Oh packs. But I think it would be cool if you could. So I feel like we are in this cycle where no one is drafting Yu-Gi-Oh, so Konami doesn't feel incentivized to make draftable Yu-Gi-Oh packs. And while there's no draftable Yu-Gi-Oh packs, no one is going to start drafting. Like, drafting will not become a thing with the way Yu-Gi-Oh packs are at the moment, right? I'm planning to make a draft video soon. I'm gonna get Retro Pack 2 for this, which is getting reprinted. And Retro Pack 2, because it's 20 years old, actually works for drafting, from what I've heard. There even is, in Konami's defense, there is Retro Pack 2 draft as a public event format. I think they had it at YCS Bologna, and some people did it, and apparently it's pretty fun. So I'm trying that for a video. I'm gonna record my draft perspective, like with the GoPro, and then we'll see how it goes. We'll see if it's fun. But in general, I think there's a lot of ways to make Yu-Gi-Oh fun, even on a non-competitive level. Like domain format is another example that I've enjoyed a lot, and I really wonder why not more people are playing domain format. It's awesome. But it always seems to be tied to like, there needs to be official support for it, and then there needs to be like events for it, where, you know, like it, and I think that's, I guess, where Genesis is headed as well, is like Genesis is going to be another way to play Yu-Gi-Oh, which is awesome. I like that a lot. But even there, of course, I mean, people are going to take it seriously. I don't necessarily think that's a problem, though. I think more ways to play is always better. And things like drafting, things like cubing, Things like alternative formats like Domain, where you play with 4 people and like it's kind of like Magic Commander. This sort of thing, I personally love it. It might also, I can speak for myself here. One reason why I don't do this sort of thing very often is because advanced constructed format is already pretty time consuming to keep up with. So like if you're a competitive Yu-Gi-Oh player, I guess like spending time on those alternative ways to play might feel like you're losing time on the competitive side, and you need that time, right? I think that's maybe, at least for me, that is an argument that definitely matters.
That since this is a company implemented shift, the interest for this is a little bit artificial since there is an incentive to play it in prizing. And that means that the culture TCG side has not changed. Genesis is excellent, but I'm worried if Genesis were to stop getting support one day, then the players will just stop playing decks aside from the meta, which will greatly hurt less serious players, and it doesn't have to be that way. So I'm going to describe the general culture of playing the OCG because it is genuinely vastly different. My experience playing in the TCG was that you would drive to locals maybe once or twice a week, pay the entry fee, and then play those games. I only played 2 years of TCG, so maybe I'm wrong about that, but that was my experience. That's not really how it works here. Or it is. There are tournaments in locals, of course, but that's not how a lot of
that sums it up pretty well.
People, and I would even say the majority of people here play.
Bro got alpha'd.
When I first returned to China, I spoke to my friends that I had met at locals and asked what tournaments there are, and they were confused why I would even want to enter those. And that really surprised me because I didn't understand what other alternatives there were. If you come from the TCG, it is a given that you enter locals or tournaments. Otherwise, you're just going to be a DB or MD warrior. It turns out that there are a massive amount of players in the OCG who just walk into the store and then ask people to play at all times of the day.
I will say, I'm not sure how common this is. I guess you can share your experiences. But in my city, I learned... So basically, we didn't have locals for the longest time, and I thought that was really sad. And then a locals opened relatively close to where I live. And only after that locals opened, I learned that there's been a group of people at the university, and not only students, but like they would meet up at the university cafeteria basically every week, and they still do, to just play Yu-Gi-Oh. And there were no tournaments there whatsoever, but they just met up and they still do every Monday. They just meet and they play. And I think it ranges from people playing casual decks to people just there to trade, to people actually playing competitive decks. They even play Domain format there sometimes. I was there once to play some Domain, which was awesome as well. And so I will say that side of the game, that side of the hobby, is also very fun and enjoyable. And some of the people actually don't even go to locals there. They prefer going to that, you know. They don't go to locals because, you know, you have to pay entry fee and everyone's playing more serious decks and whatever. And then they prefer just meeting up with people where it doesn't cost them anything and they just play a couple of games, you know, no commitment. And that's awesome too, you know. It's also pretty fun. So I guess maybe that's, I think that's Sunny's point, is right. Like there's more ways to play Yu-Gi-Oh than just to enter tournaments. And I do agree with that statement. I think that is sometimes overlooked and a lot of people are taking it very seriously, which is also fun, but not the necessarily only way to do it. On the other hand, though, I guess one counter argument is that also there is definitely a very casual niche for Yu-Gi-Oh. You know, like you look at content creation. Some of the largest content creators for Yu-Gi-Oh are the ones who are promoting like not playing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, but rather just like, you know, series where they built their own decks, or draft as well, right? Draft is something we've talked about. Like I think the Wonky Quartet, they do a lot of like stuff like this, you know, with drafting and stuff like that. But I guess this is like, and I guess that's where the community should make the jump from, because people are watching that content, right? They like that content, they watch it, but it's not as easy to do it yourself because you can't do this in Master Duel. And I guess setting it up with your own cards is a little more difficult because there aren't really any packs that you can draft from. So you have to like curate your own cube, which some people do that. Some people do have a cube to cube with. I've cubed in the past because someone has brought a cube to tournaments, and then you sit down with a couple of people and you cube. But I guess people don't really meet up for this. They don't go to the YCS 2 cube. And sometimes I wish sometimes I find myself genuinely sometimes wanting there to be like an event where it's not about the main tournament, but it's also just about like having fun. Because I always find I mean, a YCS is fun, but when I travel to a YCS, I barely have any time to do such things, right? Because there's always the main event happening, and that's what everyone cares about. So it's like more. I'm saying I think it'd be really cool if there was also like a convention for Yu-Gi-Oh that wasn't always tied to a tournament. Because of course, naturally, when there's a YCS, you go there, but you focus on the main event, because that's just kind of how it goes. If that wasn't happening, then like if you weren't focusing on the main event, you feel like you'd be missing out. And I think for Magic, they have this. I'm not entirely sure, but I guess Magic players can let me know. But I think there's conventions for Magic where it's not necessarily about like a huge tournament, but they just meet up and play. Like Magic Con, I've heard that term before. Maybe Magic Con does have a big tournament happening, but it's to me it always sounded like it was more like just people meeting up because they enjoy the game, right? And just play whatever they feel like, not one big tournament. I don't know. It sounds fun to me.
The day, irrespective of events.
But maybe it's also just maybe there is big tournaments happening and people just choose to not play them, which is something that I technically, if I wanted this, I could also do that, right? Like I could go to a YCS and not enter the main event. It just feels weird to me to do that.
I really do mean at all times of the day. I didn't start work until September, so I had about a month before I started. And then during August, I was camping locals every single day. Like starting from noon, there are just people there in the shop trying to play games. And honestly, now that I've been back for a while, I'm a little bit confused how that's possible because they're not at school or work, but it happens. It's just a thing. The ultimate practical effect of this is that since players play outside of events, it means that there is a culture of players that will play the game irrespective of prizing and irrespective of how competitive your deck is. It sounds a little bit cheesy, but it really does feel like, to me at least, that people play here a lot more for the love of the game. So to go into more detail, it's very common for people to walk into locals with several decks and then ask around for opponents and also ask what decks people brought. And then players will self-power pair based on deck choice.
I think this is a very wholesome approach to this hobby. It's awesome that people do this, and they should do it more in the TCG territories as well. But I will say once again, from the experiences I've shared earlier, that I do know people that do this. It's maybe they're in the minority here. Maybe maybe the numbers are higher of people doing this in the OCG, but people definitely do this in the TCG. But I think encouraging this more is good.
A very common conversation would go something like, "Hey, do you want to play? I'm playing Goatee today." And then I would just respond, "Oh, sorry, I only brought Malice today." And it's because of this
I only brought Malice, bro. No one wants to play with you.
Power pairing casual environment that people bring all sorts of different decks and you get so many pet deckers. In previous videos, I spoke about how there's so many pet deckers, and that's why you walk into a local in 2025 and you see Tri-Brigade Sprite or Dragon Link, Emancipator, Goatee, Purely, Lab, or whatever. It's why sometimes I sit down and I play someone having never seen an archetype before. I played some guy who was playing a deck I didn't even know existed, which was apparently called Dual Avatar. The field spell summons these tokens, and then he just ended on 2 fusions. So then I asked him why he didn't link the tokens, and apparently he's fusion locked. Honestly, if he just wanted to start cheating, I would have let him. I still don't understand how it's possible that people pick up decks that are truly this terrible, but that's actually just how some people here are. But I could never imagine someone in the TCG trying to go to locals with Dual Avatar, especially because they're paying money to enter the event and then they're going to be mostly playing against the meta. The reason this is all possible is because
Yu-Gi-Oh is at its most fun when both decks are at the same power level. It doesn't matter if that power level is super high or super low. So the idea of like going to a convention or just a place where Yu-Gi-Oh players meet and bringing multiple decks and then having different power levels available, and then someone says, "Hey, I would like to play my Goatee deck," and then you're like, "Okay, well then I'm not going to play my high power tier 1 meta deck. I'm going to play something like my pet deck." That can lead to a lot of fun. It doesn't get you any tournament wins or any recognition, but ultimately, I don't know, like it might not be what you play Yu-Gi-Oh for. You know, like if you just want to have a good time, then this seems like a pretty wholesome approach.
decks can survive when you play against things that aren't the best decks in the room, and this isn't necessarily true if there isn't this casual and self-power pairing culture in the TCG. And this is so special because Not only is this another way to play for other players, but for me personally, Rogue versus Rogue is when you get some of the funniest game states in Yu-Gi-Oh! I always bring this up because it is the most hilarious thing I've seen in Yu-Gi-Oh! To date, but a Runic Stun player is playing against Kashira, and then the Kashira player makes Mind Hacker to try and reverse deck out the Runic Stun player. Like, only when you get a massive amount of these casual deck players will you see things like this. I'm not saying that this never happens in the TCG, I'm sure that there are people who bring La Dolce to locals, but the scale is smaller, the culture is very different, and anyone who has played in both will tell you that this is true. For me personally...
Okay, now, I need to know how this pairing happened. How did the Runic Stun player and the Kashtira player meet each other? The way I envision it is like there's a store full of people all there to play casually and have fun. So they both go there and ask everyone, do you want to play? And everyone said no. And then they were just the last two people in the entire room that no one wanted to play with. So they decided to play against each other. That's how I envision this happening. Which is awesome. I'm very happy we talked about that.
I really feel like if I didn't move back, I probably would have just stopped going to locals had I stayed in the TCG. Because, like, okay, I rightfully got flamed for saying this last year. I am not old, but I'm 24, and yet again, I'm making...
Bro, you said you were old with 24? Jesus.
I'm getting older. And I don't think I could maintain the motivation to drive 40 minutes to work and then 40 minutes back as opposed to just hopping on a metro. From my office to locals is 7 to 9 minutes from work. When I first moved back, I entered a lot more events, but there's only so many times I can spend 7 hours to win a deck box or some sleeves. I don't really enter local tournaments anymore either. I just go to locals and play with people. If I'm trying to test for a larger event, I can sit down with my testing group and we can get games way faster that way and also recreate game states to collaboratively figure out how to play out situations. As opposed to the TCG where I have to look up when the locals is being held and then only go during that specific time. So why is that the case? What makes it so that East Asia has both such a strong casual player base and one that is extremely active without events? I'll go over 2 structural factors that I think aren't the real reason and then finish with the factors that I think are real. To start off with the 2 fake reasons, the first one is price. The TCG does cost more money to play, but that's mostly true in the context of playing meta decks. If you're trying to play a casual deck, it doesn't really cost that much more money, and I would even argue it's cheaper for North Americans and most Europeans. If we're using purchasing power parity, $20 for Melodious in the US, even making minimum wage in most states, is less expensive than spending $10 for Melodious in most East Asian cities because our average income is much lower.
That's probably true. Like rogue decks for the most part, like if you were just playing casually and everyone has casual decks, that would be pretty cheap. At the same time, I just don't know if that really isn't happening. Like, I think there are people that do this. You just don't hear about it online because they don't post like, oh, tournament winning deck profile or whatever, right? This is just something, maybe the difference between the West and the East in this regard is that in the East, they meet up at locals because there are a lot more local stores there and it's much more like accessible and easier to travel to a locals and just sit down with people. And maybe here, it's more like friend group related and they meet in private and don't post about it online, right? So like, I do think this is happening. Maybe you just don't see it as much. And so maybe the takeaway from this is not that this isn't happening, but rather than the people that are taking Yu-Gi-Oh! Very seriously, like myself, could maybe think about doing this more often, right? Maybe it is a behavior that you can adapt for yourself, right? And I genuinely, every time I do this, every time I play Cube, every time I just meet up with people to play Domain or whatever, I always think to myself, hey, this is fun, I should do this more often, right? And then I often just end up not doing it more often. I just end up doing it very rarely, but every time I do, it's very fun.
So if you're trying to buy most rogue decks, I would be very surprised if the core came anywhere close to $50 and is often less than half of that with very few exceptions such as Lab. So I don't think the cost is the reason people don't play these casual decks as often as the OCG. The second fake reason, in my opinion, is the casual tournaments. So last video, the Floodgate one, I talked about how we have 2 different types of tournaments in China, points tournaments and for fun tournaments. There's a pretty reasonable argument to make that this tournament structure causes this cultural difference. But I do think it's actually reverse causal. I believe that because we have casuals, more casuals, that created a demand for these types of free-to-play casual tournaments with special rules because many of the players that play casually don't enter any tournaments in the first place. If the casual tournaments created the player base, then it would make sense to me that they would continue to enter these tournaments rather than the opposite. Now I'll transition to what I consider to be the top 3 most important structural factors that actually stop casual culture in the West. So the first one is the raw quantity of locals. The last time I mentioned this, I got flamed a little bit.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like we have less locals, so it's harder to just go to a place. Like I cannot go to locals at any day of the week and expect people to be there, simply because we don't really have that culture where people will go to locals and hang out before local starts, or maybe they would be down to play a couple of extra games after locals ends or whatever. But I don't think I can go there any day of the week and expect a bunch of people to be there. Maybe if you get really lucky, you'll find someone who happens to be there at the same time. But for the most part, we don't have this sort of culture where people are just hanging out at locals. And I'm just thinking back, like back in the day, now Ankh is going to tell you about war again. Like when I was in school, like literally like 15 years ago, I would often during the summer holidays, I would go to locals on days where there were no locals, and just hang out. I used to do that. Whatever happened to doing that?
Because the example I showed in my video was Akihabara, and yes, obviously Akihabara is going to be the most amount of locals out of anywhere. But the place I live also has 20 or more locals within a 30-minute metro ride of me. I just didn't use a screenshot of my location.
Did the dinosaurs hang out too? Sometimes I would play goat format with the Stegosaurus. Yes.
Because I didn't want to dox myself. It is very normal for you to have easy access to locals no matter where you live in a big East Asian city, as opposed to some cities in the US like Boston, where Yugioh locals are borderline extinct. The zoning laws in the US just make it a lot harder for there to be many locals. In North America, zoning laws are essentially exclusive, as in they'll assign 1 or 2 purposes per zone. While in Japan, for example, zoning is inclusive because they tend to tolerate anything that is up to a minimum nuisance level and allow anything under that. Basically, there is just less land available for someone to open a small business since rent is higher, and that land zoned for commercial and non-industrial use tends to be farther away from where people actually live. The second is
okay, that was a lot of economic stuff. I don't know.
Transportation. Now, just to preface, I want to say that I love every single country I've ever lived, and I consider each and every one of them to be one of my homes.
Why are we doing a Cybers combo in Memento, by the way?
However, the public transportation in North America is respectfully pathetic. I actually had an opportunity this year to go back to Montreal and also New York.
Pathetic is a very nice way to put it.
To see my friends for the first time in 3 years, and Montreal and New York are 2 cities with some of the best public transportation in all of North America, and it is still not excellent. Not only is it extremely slow, but it is also inconsistent. I took the subway in New York, and the first day I stepped in, there's a guy threatening to kill every single person in the car, and people are just laughing at that. Okay, actually that's not really fair because it's not really related to
what are we talking about right now?
Public transportation, but also my metro car got delayed by 30 minutes because they had to stop the trains for some reason. So I was late to Gamers Choice Locals. This is supposed to be the
I was late to locals. Okay, now we're making. Okay, now it all comes full circle. All right, fair enough. Good.
best
Okay,
metro in the entire US, and it is
Got
definitely
it.
far superior to something like the T in Boston, which is borderline unusable. The number one thing that bothers me about traveling to North America is since I do not live there, I don't have a car anymore, and that means I can't get anywhere. It is so frustrating. I'm pretty sure that Europe is better. The tube in London is actually okay, but it's still
Europe is better, but I've been to Japan, and it's not that good.
nowhere near as comprehensive or fast as the metro in Chinese cities. If you have never been to an East Asian city, then I'll just say you've never experienced good.
So yeah, if you combine better public transport with higher density of locals, you get a culture where it's more feasible for multiple people to meet at locals at any time or any day of the week, right? That is just a fact, right? It's easier to do this in the OCG. But the location where you play or where you meet does not necessarily mean that casual Yu-Gi-Oh is less popular in the West. Maybe you just don't see it because people don't meet in public spaces. And people meeting in public spaces is good because it's a lower barrier to entry, right? You don't have to have an established friend group already to go to a public space and join, which definitely helps this for sure.
Public transportation, which means in the West, it is hard for people to just go to locals all the time, as opposed to bigger cities in East Asia where you can just metro to locals whenever you want to play anything. Now, for these problems, I'm mostly just describing what is in reality. I'm not saying the US should just fix its public transportation. Obviously, they can't really do that for a variety of reasons, like The cost of improving public transportation is much higher than just building new public transportation because all of the people that would need the New York subway to go to work would just get destroyed, as opposed to China, which industrialized very late and thus has very new technology for its public transportation when it was building it. The population that needs public transportation the most is less wealthy, which means they have less political influence. And
all of this was this one memento turn, by the way.
Americans already have car culture, so it's not really a high priority to fix it. And then there's also large car companies that are lobbying against better public transportation. It's kind of unfixable, to be honest. The last reason is that anime is far bigger in East Asia than the West, and a lot of people are naturally introduced to Yu-Gi-Oh! If they're into anime because they're deeply tied communities, which means that Yu-Gi-Oh! In the East is so big and so mainstream. I've brought this up before in older videos, and there's always comments that say, I just don't understand how big anime is in the US. That might be true, but I was there recently, and I still think many Westerners just don't know the scale for how big anime is in the East. I agree that anime is getting more mainstream in North America, but it is still nowhere near East Asia. Even the Western countries that love anime the most, such as France, don't have as much as we do. If you've been to Japan, obviously...
higher general player base means you're going to have more casuals as well. That's also another factor, for sure.
Anime is massive. Everywhere you go, you will see it. It advertises for local infrastructure. The JR line in Tokyo essentially has an anime girl as the mascot. Love Live is essentially the mascot for Numazu, which is a literal city. And in China, it's the same. For context, I left China in 2014, so if you're like me and you left China a little while ago, you probably may be surprised. But back in my day, you had to go to specific areas.
Back in my day, bro, you're 24. You don't get to say that yet.
Now you can't avoid it if you try. If you go out to eat, there's a high likelihood you'll hear anime music. There's limited random collaborations with all known chains. So for example, when I go to Dairy Queen, there's like random Hatsune Miku or Skip and Loafer collaborations. Cosplayers are also everywhere. I work 6 days a week. And then when I go to work in an average week, I will say there is almost a 100% chance that I'm going to see some cosplayer on the metro sometime that week. My mom actually asked me why there's so much cost now. Like, it's so big that even my mom knows what it is. When I walk to work, I see giant billboard signs that wish Itadori happy birthday. And most importantly, we have way more gacha culture than the West. I think this is the true crucial reason because TCGs are not so deeply tied to anime in the West as they are here. So you can almost expect people, my generation, early 20s, to be into something that has random purchases because it is just that omnipresent. Again, my experience is limited to bigger cities, and I'm not saying everyone does this, but if you socialize with people in their early 20s, I'd say it's very likely you will find people who buy gacha products. My friends I met at the gym or coworkers in office buildings buy these things. These are people who almost seem like the opposite consumer base, but they still like to buy random goods.
Like anime, especially, and trading cards have gotten a lot more popular here, especially during COVID. But I definitely have to agree. Like I've been to Japan and it is not the same. Like the degree to which this has been normalized here is not even close to what it's over there. And that definitely plays into like how openly people like just go to locals, hang out there and stuff like that, you know. And even it goes through more age groups as well in Asia. I think there is more people of all ages that are playing Yu-Gi-Oh, rather than like, I feel like here it's very like, I mean, at this point, like I guess anywhere from 20 to 35 ish, around that is like the general, like the generations that play Yu-Gi-Oh, and you'll rarely find people younger and older than that.
To emphasize how big Yu-Gi-Oh is, I was at a company dinner, and then my coworker exposed me. He said, "Oh, do you all know that Sunny is a world champion for Yu-Gi-Oh?" I can feel my face burning up. I've never been so nervous before in my entire life. I don't consider myself socially awkward, but I like to keep my private and public life separate, and I'm just having all these thoughts like, will they...
Bro, why did we SP the Primite when we knew they had Gamma in hand, is all I can think about right now.
Think I'm not taking my job seriously? I can't even explain this away because if you search for me, you won't find it since it's Edison, not Actual Worlds. I honestly thought that was it for my job. And then my other coworker's daughter actually says, "Oh, I play too. I play with my friends during lunch. What deck do you play?" "I play Draco Tail." And I'm just unlocked because I can't tell if it's better that someone else plays or if it's worse because I have the same hobbies as a middle schooler. Anyways, I'm not fired, and in fact, my coworkers thought it was a good hobby to have. I'm only telling the story just because it is literally that big.
I talked about Yu-Gi-Oh once in an interview for a job while I was a student, and I think it was a positive. because they understood that it was something I was passionate about. They understood it was something that required strategic thinking. And it wasn't even like the two that interviewed me. One of them was about my age, and one of them was older. So it was not just because one of the younger one knew what it was, but the older one didn't. But they kind of understood, like, it, I don't know. I struggle to see why it's ever a bad thing that someone is passionate about something. I don't know. But so I would encourage people to tell, you know, others about their hobbies, but at the same time, there are people out there who will look at you and be like, oh, that's a children's card game or whatever. I don't know. I think that's stupid, but I don't know. I have not made that experience personally here, but I definitely know there is people out there that'll think about you like that.
But it's so obvious that Yu-Gi-Oh players here are just massive weebs. Ignoring the anime accessories, there's
Okay.
a reason a ton of Chinese players can just play in Japanese if they want to. Like sometimes I'll be playing and then
What did you do before going full-time streamer? I studied software engineering, and when I finished I started streaming, and then I finished university while I was streaming. And I also worked a job, well, as a software engineer during university, basically.
my opponent will just be like, これが俺の力
What does that mean?
Demon Smith Requiem Koka. And I'm like, alright.
Okay, what just happened?
Demon Smith Requiem Koka. And I'm like, alright.
Okay.
I don't really know why you suddenly started LARPing in Japanese, but sure. Iyo, male lentil. I guess the reason I'm talking about this is because there's all these videos like mid-core Yu-Gi-Oh is dead, the casual scene is dead. It just seems like players are very unhappy and
No, I understand we're talking about Fiends with Requiem, but why did bro say Coca?
to an extent, I do think that it is due to structural reasons. It is easier for us to have that casual player base. But I think even when I evaluate the conditions of the West, there is the possibility
Oh, Kokai's effect. Dude, I'm too Twitch brained for this. I'm too Twitch brained for this. I got very confused because of the Twitch emote that's called Coca. Okay, all right, moving on.
to enjoy Yu-Gi-Oh the way many do over here. Because let's be real, Genesis does let you play more decks that are otherwise underplayed. But just using the example from earlier, I would be very surprised if anyone was busting out dual avatar in Genesis. It is still a competitive format at the core, and there's naturally going to be a strong meta at the top. I do think while the argument that Genesis format is kind of like company driven because they've invented it, I still think the success that Genesis is having right now, which it definitely has success, whether you like the format or not is a different story, but Genesis is well received. People like the idea. The Genesis public events are filling up, and I was also told that at YCS Bologna they ran way more Genesis 8-man on-demand events than Edison, for example. Like, people like the idea of Genesis format. It's a successful idea, and I think that proves that there are people out there who are interested in playing Yu-Gi-Oh in different ways. You know, this is not. I think maybe Sunny is viewing this a little bit too negatively, because I think the culture for casual Yu-Gi-Oh is there in the West. I mean, of course, it's going to be less than in the OCG. The OCG basically has more of everything when it comes to trading card games, right? They got more players, more locals, more casuals, like all of that, of course. So of course you're going to notice it more over there, but I do notice it over here. But if anything, what I take away from this video is that it gets me thinking about like multiple ways to enjoy the game. And you know, every time I try an alternative way to play Yu-Gi-Oh, I like it. You know, I enjoy Time Wizard, I enjoy Genesis, I enjoy cubing, I enjoy domain format. I'm pretty sure I'm gonna enjoy drafting with Retro Pack 2. I think that's gonna be awesome too. And so, like, if anything you take away from this is that Yu-Gi-Oh ultimately is a hobby. We're all playing it to have fun, and there are a lot of ways to enjoy Yu-Gi-Oh even besides just competitive try-harding. And if you haven't tried any of those things yet, then I would highly encourage you do. And I think that's just what we take away from this. You know, like I think there is already a lot of people who are doing this, but I think it could be so much more, and more ways to play Yu-Gi-Oh is good. That these lower power decks that never got played or outdated decks are a really fun way for casual players to experience Yu-Gi-Oh! And the player base doesn't need Konami to start that gameplay. It could be done as long as the player base itself starts playing more casually.
Which is also a proven concept, by the way, in other card games. In Magic, you know, some of the formats they play, they started because the community just started doing it. That goes for Commander mainly, right? Like Commander became a format in Magic. Of course, it took a long time, but like not everything needs to be introduced by Konami themselves. Like people can just start playing Yu-Gi-Oh in certain ways, and if that sort of thing like becomes popular, then maybe eventually it'll be officially recognized. But even if it's never officially recognized, who needs this sort of thing when you're just playing for fun? Not everything needs tournaments, you know? You can just draft for the sake of drafting. You can just play Domain for the sake of playing Domain or whatever. Like I think that's also something that like I feel. I guess that's also a cultural difference between the West and the East. That maybe more people immediately attach all of it to like, oh, what kind of bank am I making if I go, like, is it worth playing this game if I'm not making money off of it? And I guess I do see this sort of like mentality more here. Even to be fair, how would I see it in the OCG? I'm not actively playing in the OCG, but I do see a lot of people acting like this in the West, where they will measure everything they do by how much money it makes them, which is something that, I mean, of course, it's a privileged thing to say, but I would like to not always think about that when I choose what to do for fun, at least.
Or not. Maybe TCG players are happy the way it is now with Genesis. I don't know, because all of my TCG friends are competitive players. I just want people to start thinking about these things, because a lot of what I enjoy more about the OCG is due to our player culture, not anything that Konami has done specifically for the OCG.
Nice.